And we're live. Twitch is being a little temperamental, so I am not entirely sure how well this will come through. So I guess just soldier on. Right, so in the last episode, we were looking at ways of trying to get this turkey character into IMVU in a way that we kept the amount of data that we were producing via FBX to a minimum, but we were getting something that looked relatively random or less robotic than the robot turkey would ordinarily. Oh, hi Frenzy. Yes, very. Yes, morning. So we were looking at trying to produce a series of short sequences that we could then essentially duplicate up, create mode, duplicate up and produce longer sequences. But we came across a couple of issues with the way that that's done. Well, not so much the way that it's done in Blender, in IMVU, but the way that IMVU interprets the data. So I did we save? Yes, we saved. So let's just open this. So double check, what were we doing? Okay, right. Shouldn't have loaded that one first. That was what we discovered offline trying to get this to work. Was this just the mesh? I think this is just the mesh. Yeah, so this is just the mesh imported. Right, so... Right, so the issue we had was trying to figure out how to make the character look random. Based on a set of sequences that we've exported from Blender. So we've got a huge, not a huge set, but these are all relatively speaking about 30 frames long, all of them. So we don't have any major synchronization issues because of the way that we set up the character, so that the overall mesh and the skeleton is controlled by a control node. Let's use the scenes, so these are active. So this is our control node, this wireframe, and that controls the armature and the mesh, whereas the armature on its own will just control the character. So what we've done is we've split the animation into two segments or two sections, or broken it down into two aspects of the overall thing. So the control node animates, and the mesh armature animates. And what we discovered in the last episode is that we need to create some pauses or animation sequences that were essentially of static poses, essentially. We have to keep in mind that when we're exporting these, we need to actually have something happen as per the requirements of exporting FBX. Generally speaking, there needs to be something within the sequence indicating that there's something going on, or the FBX won't export. So we just export these as additional frames, and we can ignore those once we get the thing into IMVU. But we've created a set of static positions, because what we were trying to do was to get the character to hop from facing front, which is this way, from facing front to either the left or the right side. But the way that we'd done the animation originally meant that short left, is that the return? That's doing something it shouldn't be doing. But essentially, the sequence that we have is of it turning from front to left. Oh yeah, that's right. That is the front, because the front's where the nuts are. But we could have addressed this problem by creating a set of an additional set of frames where the character just remained facing this way, or left or right. So it's an either or. Either you can add additional keyframes and use those once we get into IMVU, or you can just create a static pose, again 30 frames with our FBX requirement at the end there that we can ignore. So once those are done in Blender and you've exported them to FBX, they can be brought in to IMVU and played around with, so that we're using the loop end and the loop start and loop end frames to loop certain elements and aspects of the animation. But what we can do is use the same animation sequence and just get it to do different things. Right, so idle torso, idle torso. So for instance, the torso, this idle animation, which looks like it's essentially breathing, that's repeated twice. That's these two. So that's ensemble 0 and ensemble 3. But the difference is the number of loops that are played. So depending on after playing what that's set to, if it's set to new ensemble, it'll randomly choose an animation, or it'll randomly choose an ensemble from the listing in the ensemble, in the ensemble section of the action tab, or it'll play through them or just repeat. But this is how IMVU gets the avatar to look like it's doing random stuff, is that it has a whole host of ensembles. Annotation tool again. So in this section, actually green, needs to be green, otherwise we can't see it. So in this section we have a whole list of animation sequences, and depending on what this is set to, it'll either play through all of them in sequence, one of them repeatedly, or randomly select. And we can get rid of that. We can set some of them up so that we are using the same animation or the same XAF, but we just change some of the parameters. So the turkey at the moment is just looping through, well, it's not looping, it's got a choice of this static pose, which is it just breathing, it looking to the left and tilting its head to the left. And depending on what IMVU selects, it will do either or whatever it selects to do. But to get it to work properly, we need to compensate for your animation sequences need to have that pause in them. Otherwise it just essentially goes through all of them without any care, because obviously it doesn't know what the animation is actually supposed to be. So if you're not careful, you can just get it to keep playing the same sequences, but you lose any sense of life isn't quite the right word, but the fact that there's no pauses in between the animations means that it's just playing through the sequences. So to avoid that, you need to build in pauses into the sequences. So we can, as was saying earlier, we can do that by either creating a separate sequence that does just that. So this is the position of the control node, not what the animation, not what the character's actually doing. That's static for most of the animation. And then, of course, we've got the FBX requirement to have the change there so that the FBX exporter knows that something's going on. So ignore all that. So the actual pose is the highlighted duplicate frames. So that's these two. Annotate. So that's these two. This is the sequence. And it means that this just remains static. So that was one way of dealing with it. Or we add the static to the end of an animation that we've already got. So depending on how you want to address the issue in terms of what the animation is actually supposed to do will depend on whether you use this approach where you just add additional static frames at the end of a sequence, or you create a separate one. But this was the only way we could get this to work the way that it's the only way that we could get it to work in a way that looked like, well, something reasonable, essentially. So what I'll do is close this, and then so to put all of this together, so derive a new product, rooms and furniture item, because this is a furniture item, go Alright, so we've got our default scene. FBX import, load FBX, and it should be at our, yes it is, FBX folder number 36. So this FBX is the project everything's selected. The furniture root node, which is the large one, that's selected last, and then we just export to FBX. Use the settings that we've said explained before. So selected objects, disable, 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 and then export. Right, so 36. So we get the select skeleton root, as discussed before. You want the one that's generally going to be, generally contains the most bones, which is the entire structure of the character. So make sure that's selected. That'll show the meshes that are associated with it, and then click Configure FBX. Right, so one of the issues that we discovered in the last episode was the fact that I'm still not entirely sure where the duplication occurs, but this is duplication. So it lists about, I guess there's about 30 sequences there. The actual object, there's only about, I think about 20 or so. Offline investigation may have discovered why this occurs. Whoops. So in IMVU, when you're importing, you get a lot of duplicates. And there'll be specific types of duplication, which will be clear in a second. So we've got this control hop short right return. That's what that one is. But these control hop shorts, these are all the control nodes. The animations associated with this node, and they are being duplicated because this is an object level animation sequence. In other words, it's not an armature where bones are changed and manipulated. It's an object level sequence. So the difference is that for an armature, when we want an armature to control something, let me just stop this from swizzling around and select a so the difference between the two is that armature based animation is essentially a sub-object based manipulation system. In that, the armature itself, which is an object, let me just Control H, insert, and hide H. So this thing that we are looking at is an object. It is an armature object, and it is comprised of, or comprised from, sub-objects, and these sub-objects are bones. And when we're animating, it's the bones that do the mesh deformation, that change how the mesh is positioned. It's not the armature that's doing that, it's the bones within the armature. So this is essentially an animation or a motion system that uses sub-objects to do the animation. But Blender also allows us to animate objects. So I'll have to unhide them now, so that's Alt-H. So each of these nodes and the armature itself is an object. But the difference is that the nodes can only be objects. There is no hierarchical internal structure to a node. So it remains, and it is always seen as an object. But if you have an animation that's associated with an object as opposed to bones within an armature, when we export these, the exporter duplicates the object animation and assigns it to all the other objects that it finds. So the animation for this control node is also then linked to the mesh, the armature, but not the bones, and the root node of the furniture item. And this is why we get this duplication. It took a while of investigation trying to figure out what was going on there. So this basically means that when we are importing FBXs with a complex scene, this is a relatively complex scene, we have to tidy up or account for this duplication. So the object that we actually do want to animate is called is turkey root. So that's just called turkey root. So anything else that has control, hop, short left, or whatever the other animations are, anything else that has these attributed to it, so that would be turkey mesh or bolts mesh or any of the other objects, need to be unchecked because they're not needed. These are duplicates, so uncheck all of these. We need those, we need those. We don't need these because, again, this is a duplication of the turkey node animations being attributed to the turkey rig, which is controlling the mesh. So we deselect those as well. So we should have then turkey root, and these are the ones that we want to keep. Whoops. Because those are the proper associations or the proper assignments. Hot Rod, just reading your... well, armature is just a descriptive word for the skeleton. I mean, obviously an armature is a specific object. An armature is a specific type of object in Blender. So you could use the word skeleton sort of interchangeably, because you could be referring to an armature if there were only an armature in the scene, but the overall skeleton, as in the mechanism that's controlling the overall project, comprises the furniture node, the turkey control node, and the armature. So these three objects are actually the skeleton, the overall skeleton for the project. So you could use either or, but you generally be best trying to stick to the names that are known and or defining the context within which you're using the word skeleton. Yes, yes, so that's, yeah. Yeah, so someone's FA28, it's just basically saying also the term used to describe the bone skeleton would depend on the software you're using. Yes, so obviously because we're using Blender, our armature is our skeleton, but within the context of IMVU, our skeleton is comprised of a couple of nodes and the armature of the object. So context, yeah, so context matters. So that's why the duplication occurred. It's because object-based animation sequences will be applied to all the objects that are in the scene, rather than the ones that are assigned with the manipulation of the bones. So you can deselect them if you know which ones they are. Otherwise, it'll just import, and you'll have to just filter through all of these once you get them into IMVU. So that's all the sequences that we need. Materials, that's okay. We need to change that to 1, and the turkey is 0 because that's to override the chair. And then our apply scale 0.01, and then just import. We'll replace the materials, that's okay. No, it's hot rod. That's fine. I mean, it's context. Context is the thing that matters. Whether you use skeleton or armature or whatever it is that you want to word that you want to use, just be aware that obviously context matters, because for us, whilst we're working in Blender, as I said, our skeleton is an armature. But the skeleton for IMVU, we can use nodes as well as an armature. But that's our skeleton for IMVU. So just that's all it is. It's just context. I mean, it's not necessary that there's a right or wrong there. Right, so we've imported those, applied changes, and there's our turkey. Ooh, also, another point that is worth noting. Because of with FBX, we no longer need to use apply. Where is it? Where's it gone? Oh, there it is. We no longer specifically need to use apply. So rotation and scale you would normally use. And you don't necessarily need to position the mesh, or any of the objects for that matter, relative to grid center if the objects don't necessarily need to be at grid center. Because FBX, so if we exported everything, this is just the mesh, so if we exported everything and the turkey was meant to be positioned back here away from grid center, the FBX export process will export this in situ where it's positioned in Blender. So that's something to be aware of. So that means that if you did a sequence, undo that, if you did a sequence for I think it's that one. Oh, yeah, so I've just unparented this. So basically the node is rotated to face the left, I think. So if you export this, so that basically means that your character would be facing left on export. With FBX, if you export with your character not facing front or the way that it should be, it will export in this orientation, position, location, whatever it is. So when you bring the thing into IMVU, the object will be facing the wrong way. So that is something that you do need to be aware of using FBX. FBX is far more, should we say generous? Can we use that word? It's far more generous with its tolerances for your project. So be aware of that. Right, so we've got the object in. Let's just quickly go through and sort out the vertex colors. Those are okay. And then we've got our vertex colors assigned. We need to check the config tab to make sure we're using the right skeleton, which we are. Everything else is okay. So actions. So this is where it gets interesting. So we want this to be stance.idle. So these animations that we're going to load will play when the thing loads. We don't need to set type. We'll leave this for later. So ensembles. So we'll load in the idle animation and just assign that. Now if we want this to loop infinitely, I don't know how well this, it's because it's relatively subtle. And of course we've got the movement of the avatar to contend with, because the camera is obviously tied to that. That's another suggestion actually. So we want to decouple the avatar camera That's another one to mention to Shannon Mack and Co. I did think of that, Frenzy, actually. So, ha ha. Right, so where were we? Alright, yes, so we've got this looping. So this is where we need to do a bit of thinking. Right, so it's now stopped. So we need to add a new ensemble. We want to select a new sequence. So let's do head lookup. Apply change. And that's all it does. It just looks up. Oh, it's not going to do it now. Oh, and I think the default, if you don't set anything here, I think the default is that it picks it picks one, which is the middle one. Not the middle one. It randomly selects if you don't add something here. So we've got two. It's going to add another one, but we're going to duplicate the idle animation. Idle. Going to add another one. What we'll do here is head look left. Add the idle one again. And then add a slightly different one. Look left torso. So what we're going to do with these idle torso sequences is change the number of times that they loop. So for the first one it's just 1 and maybe 3 and 5, but we don't want them to be we don't want them to necessarily follow on. So we'll give this one a number of 5 and then this one 3. So what have we got? Head look up. Head look left. And then look left, torso. So each of these will just play once. These three. Can we do a shift? No, we can't do a shift click. Hang on then. Annotate. So these three they'll play once. But these three they'll play 1, 3, and 5. Not specifically in that order. So if we now set this ensembles played to 0, it basically means that this entire ensemble will keep looping through based on the animation XAFs that we've added, the number of times that they are meant to loop, and how they are supposed to play one after the other, depending on what we select here. So if we do cycle through, what it should do is play the breathing once, head look, breathing, head look, breathing, head look. Which is what it should be doing now. So I don't know how clearly these animations will come through on the Twitch thingamajiggery. But obviously if you do that with cycling, it'll just keep playing the sequence, which makes this look robotic. So the best one to use is pick new ensemble, and that randomizes it. And what that can mean is that in some instances it may play the same sequence. So we've got the middle idle animation looping 5 times. So it may be that this sequence loops that XAF 5 times itself. So that's 5. So it may select this 5 times in a row, which means that you're going to get 5. What's internet math warning? 5535. So 25 loops of this one animation before it kicks out of that loop and selects another sequence. So this is essentially how we can create longer sequences, or the appearance of longer sequences, essentially by tricking the system, if you like, for want of a better way of explaining it. We can trick the system by using much shorter sequences, but depending on the order and how we get them set up with respect to how often they loop, what they do, as in the actual animation itself, we can create much longer sequences whilst keeping the file size down. So each of these is, let me go into debug, I think it is. No, it's assets. So that's our materials, that's the textures. These are our animations. So we haven't used much of these. But these are our file sizes. And relatively speaking, they're tiny. So we can create really long, or give the appearance of really long sequences without actually having to create massively long sequences, which is what you sometimes see people doing. So they'll be producing animations over 250 and beyond frames, and it's easier and more efficient and effective to use simple cycling, that is short sequences that repeat themselves over and over again depending on the duration that you're allowing them to play. So it's easier and more efficient and effective to use more short sequences that cycle but change up how they work within IMVU. And this is pretty much the same principle for all things. So even if you were using, although we're not doing it here, but if you were using Unity or one of the other available development kits that you can get out there now, it's the same principle. Rather than doing really long sequences, just use short cycling ones and set up scripts or your control mechanisms. In this instance, it's the ensembles and which one is being played, so that you create longer sequences that look more random. So obviously, depending on what you've got, so depending on your, just reading the comments there, see if I missed anything. So depending on the sequences, it's just a question of playing around and seeing what you can come up with the combinations that you export. So for the turkey, we've got quite a selection that can be used. And of course, you're not restricted to. So if let's just call that idle, so that we don't actually. So that's going to stop that. So what we can do is set up a similar oh, we need a trigger word. Let's do 1. So it just pecks at the ground. So that's 1. We've got another one where we can do insert the idle, add another sequence. We'll choose a different peck. Oh, and I think Hot Rod mentioned this, or we were trying to figure out what it's doing when you click the play button. So when you click the play button, I'm still a little unsure about this, but what's played is not the thing that's selected, which is what we were assuming it would do. What's played is dependent on this selection. You've got your ensemble set to. So it'll keep playing, but it's choosing a different sequence every time the button is pressed, because it's doing what the ensemble instructs it to do. So that's, let me just annotate that. So what you have this set to determines what plays down here. So unlike what we thought it was doing, or what it should do, is that when you click the play button, we were expecting it to play the highlighted sequence. It doesn't work like that. What it's doing is playing the sequence relative to the behavior of the ensemble itself, or the action overall. So it'll cycle through all of the ensembles that are listed here, depending on what's set here when you click here. It took a bit of figuring out to see what it was doing with that, but as far as I can tell, that is what it's doing. Right, so what have we got? Right, so let's add another idle. Set that loop 5, set that loop 1. Let's add another peck. Excuse me. So we'll use the same peck 5. We'll make this loop 3 times. Apply, and then we'll give this. Oh no, we can leave it as that should be okay. So peck. Pick your ensemble. Why is it not playing? Loops 1. I think that if you have the okay. So peck. So obviously it's repetitive for the purposes of illustration. So we've got it pecking once with one animation, and then we've got peck 5 with 2 different settings. And it's cycling, well, it's not cycling, it's selecting randomly which one it wants to play. But we can duplicate, we can add more life to the animation overall. This is why we want to duplicate certain sequences, because you can use the same action, which is it pecking at the ground. You can use that a number of times, but just set the loops to a different number, and it randomizes the fact that it's pecking at the ground, which is another way of, well, it's just another expression of creating that impression that there's a longer sequence being played out when it's actually comprised from what is that, five shorter sequences that just loop. So in theory, once you have your product set up, in this instance it's a turkey, in theory, if you loaded half a dozen of these in a room, because you've taken the time to do this, and you have a number of XAFs as independent ensembles, or within the ensembles you have several XAFs, and you use the same ones repeatedly, it should mean that if you load half a dozen of these in the room, they in theory should all do slightly different things, even though you've got the same sequences listed. Because of the way that it picks it should pick a new one randomly from the list, depending on what it is that you've triggered. And that's how you can get a greater degree of randomization with your product item, you know, the overall products, than you would otherwise, because it's if you think of the pets and some of the other furniture items that people have, like the cats and the dogs and all of those things, they all do the same thing over and over and over and over again, because they're just typing in a word and triggering a single sequence, and that's it. With this, you could have, would have to test it. Once this is all set up, and I've got it all set up, should be able to test this. But in theory, it should mean that if you have a number of these objects loaded into the room, each one should, in theory, be playing a slightly different variation, depending on how random this randomizer or this random selector is that IMVU's got built into this system. So that's and this is a furniture item. This isn't a pet. But you could do the same thing to pets as well, in theory. Because all the difference is, or the difference between pets, furniture items, and anything else, is just the underlying skeleton. It's just this. For a pet, that would be a slightly different setup and structure than it is for a furniture item. But a pet has a root, no different in terms of, in principle, it has a root in the same way that furniture items have. So this, in theory, could be a pet. Although, obviously, with it being a furniture item, it's not bound to the avatar. And then, obviously, once you've got everything set up, remove the bits that you don't use. And then upload. So, questions? Any questions? Yes, they are. Well, no, those are nuts and bolts. Oh, that's the tiddly highlighter. I want those are nuts and bolts, and these things are the rivets. And obviously, depending on how you want the animation to trigger. So let's do stance.idle. And this will just play. It'll start playing, obviously, when the furniture item is loaded into the room. But obviously, even though it's a furniture item, you can use the same triggers that. So if I type. So if you type a word, in this instance just wave, you can set this up, obviously, so that when the character waves, when the avatar waves, I should say, your furniture item does something. So it's all, whoops. You don't need my permission, Frenzy. That's what the videos are for. If you want to follow along and do something or other. I mean, obviously it doesn't have to be a turkey, robot turkey. Let me save this. Let me save this. Save as. FBX Turkey final 3. And of course, the biggest advantage of this is that, so we've got, I guess there's got to be a 20 or so sequences there. But the biggest advantage of doing this is that you can imagine that even though they're not particularly complicated sequences, so essentially one of the things that you might want to think of doing is that still parented? No. Right. So one of the things that you want to think of doing when you're doing something like this is that you have essentially how many? Let's look up. Let's head look up, peck, and hop. Okay, so there's tilt. So there may be 5. Let's call them activities. So there are 5 general activities. So we've got the hop. We've got a head look. This is just the head. We've got a look. So this is distinct to just tilting the head. This is the character looking to one side, so it's moving its body to one side. And then we've got peck. And then just tilt. So there are 5 or 6 basic activities, but within each of those you can have a tilt to the left or a tilt to the right. You could also have a tilt forward or a tilt back. So within that one activity you've got 4 variations of the same thing. So you can imagine that in combination, once you've got something as simple as they are relatively straightforward to do as well. So you don't necessarily need to do complicated animation sequences. You're essentially creating variants on a theme. So we have our 5 or 6 core activities. So head tilt, body tilt, twisting. But in each of those we have a forward, a back, a left and a right. And each of those is only 30 or so frames long. They're all about the same length, including the animations that control the control node. So of course, once you've exported all of those and you got them into IMVU, the different combinations that you can use with respect to that number of variants means that it's not so much that you've got an infinite number of possibilities, but instead of, or rather than, like we were talking about with the pets or the furniture items that are cats and dogs that just play one sequence over and over depending on what it is that you're doing, with this you can imagine the combinations that you can set up for this depending on how you want the object to be triggered. So we've only got 5 sequences here, but we could list all of them in fact, and this, whenever this stance idle is triggered, it will play through or have available for selection all of the sequences. So to get something that would look as if it was repeating itself, as sometimes the avatar does, you reduce the risk of that by having more sequences, even though you have 5 core themes and just slightly different variations of those themes. So this is one of the biggest advantages of doing this, is that you can create a much better sense of randomization within this system. Oh. Hi Notorious, didn't see you there. 6 a.m. Yes, that's how I feel doing the IMVU stints with Shannon Mack. So yes, when you are putting your products together, this approach is something that you ought to think about. It does require a bit of thinking beforehand, just to get a sense of what it is that you're trying to get the character to do. But once you've got everything set up and you know where you're going with it, the variety and the randomization that you can create as a result far outstrips anything that you could do with, you know, single massive animation sequences. Oh, and friends, you know, there's you don't need to ask about the videos. That's what the videos are for. It's you using the information and building your own projects with them. I mean, obviously, this is a turkey that happens to be a robot, but it could be anything. The principles are all the same. They're all the same, in fact. They are actually the same. But it doesn't matter what it is that you're doing. If you follow the principles, it will work. So for your animations, just break them down into shorter sequences, and then you can combine them together in IMVU once you've exported them as FBX, and that should be fine. It'll all work, obviously depending on the settings and the properties that you use. And then it's just a question of uploading and seeing what happens. Seeing if you can break the system. So if there are any questions, ask away, and Hot Rod's asking, can you add morphs on top of this? In theory, yes. I was thinking about that the other day after our previous episode, where we were talking nuts. That's these things at the bottom here. Because, I mean, ideally, what we would want is that as it pecks at the ground, each of these disappears, or they can be moved around, I guess, as if the thing's just picking at them and flicking them about. But to do that, then becomes a question of, well, what do we do with that in Blender? Or 3D Studio Max or whatever it is that you want to use. I haven't tested this yet. I don't know if anybody has tested this yet, but I don't know if you can export multiple armatures within an FBX and have the product. I mean, this is the advantage of FBX, is that we can use, this is specifically for Blender, that we can use these what are called null objects. These don't mean anything, they're just positions in space. So the wireframe cube that we see is essentially just a visual aid. But FBX allows us to use these to create an overall control skeleton. Now for Cal 3D previously, we could only use armatures for this, and we could only export one armature per project. But with FBX, because we can create a skeleton as opposed to using a single armature, so we're creating an overall hierarchical structure, we then have to determine whether we can use another armature to control something else within the scene that's controlled by another armature. Hang on a second, I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Just a minor emergency that had to be dealt with. So FBX may allow us to use multiple armatures within an overall skeleton. Haven't tested this, but so for the nuts, the simplest thing to do would be to assign an armature to this group and then assign a bone to each of the nuts, and then do an animation where each one moves depending on what it is that you want to do. A more complicated, relatively speaking, more complicated approach is to use a morph. I haven't used those in a while, so I'm not going to do that now. So you would set up a single morph and then manipulate the mesh with respect to the morph and then combine them. You might have to export the two separately. I'm not entirely sure how robust the FBX export import pathway is from Blender to IMVU to try exporting both, object-based animations and morphs at the same time. So if you did something like that, you might have to export them separately. but in theory, yes, you should be able to just create a skeletal animation for your main object and then maybe use a morph to manipulate the minor elements. And that would just mean obviously doing what you would normally do. So you select your ensemble sequence and add your morph. So you would have to import that. Yes, so you would probably have to import 2 FBX files, which you can do without any issue. So you would go through the import process again, and you would it would bring up the normal stuff that it does. Let me just do that now. I don't have a morph file available, but so let's just do that. So you'd have all your normal stuff. You'd deselect all of this because it's no longer needed, but at the bottom you'd have your morph sequence. So down here you'd have the morphs showing. So deselect everything, select or make sure that the morphs are all selected. Make sure that you have the same scale settings, otherwise it'll work, but it'll do some very, very weird things. And then just import, and that will then cancel. Whoops, wrong one. That will then mean that your morphs will be available. And it should then do, providing you've accounted for, so the sequences that we've been using are 30 frames. So you would want your morph to match that as best as possible so that you don't create too much of a desynchronization issue. So if you are using, so Pt.10, for instance, let's have a look at that in Blender. Pt.10. So Pt.10 is 30 frames long. So you would want your morph to be 30 frames thereabouts, and or multiples of, depending on whether you've got your sequence looping. So we've got our sequence looping here that's selected 3 times. So in theory that should mean that whatever morph is down here, you can either set your loop to 30 and loop it 3 times to match, or internet math warning, so that's 90 frames, isn't it? 3 times 3 is 30, so it's 90 frames. So you could have a morph that was 90 frames but just looped once. But doing it that way, you could have a bit more variation in terms of, let's say as it's pecking, the nuts are scattered. So if it's only 30 frames to match the skeletal animation, you're going to notice the repeat when it does do that. So if you set your morph to be 90 frames and you have your nuts being scattered about over the 90 frames, you won't get so much of a loop. What's the word I'm looking for? A loop glitch. It becomes noticeable that you're looping. So that's one thing. That's one thing you can do to offset the fact that something is looping. So you can create a loop, a short loop for one element, but a longer loop for another one. But so long as they're using multiples of the base frame length, which is 30 in this instance, so you could create a morph sequence or another animation sequence. It doesn't really matter. So if your next sequence was 60 or 90 or 120, 150 and on you go, that should be fine. So morphs, you should be able to do that. and multiples of your base frame length, and that should be fine. Yes, Hot Rod's just mentioning a lantern. Yes, so as we've said, as we've discussed, it doesn't matter what the object is. The principles of using shorter sequences and looping them and having them randomized, that's all the difference between making something look interesting as opposed to repetitive. But to make your job easier as a creator, just keep things simple. So, I mean, with a lantern, for example, you could have a lantern swinging left to right, front to back, in circles, clockwise, circles, anti-clockwise, obviously depending on which way the wind is blowing. But once you put all of that together as an ensemble and select whichever, whether you want it to cycle through them or choose a random one or play the same one over and over, that is exactly the same principle of what we've just been discussing with the turkey. It's exactly the same. Short sequences, looped and repeated, randomized. I'm not entirely sure you'd be able to do that, Notorious. Free concerts for everyone. Be slapped with the copyright. Yeah, yes, looking natural. Well, that's one of the aspects, or one of the good, one of the consequences of using shorter sequences and randomizing them. I mean, obviously with a lantern, you can't have it suddenly switching direction necessarily, but you can. No, it's not eating poo, Notorious. It's eating. They are nuts and bolts. But what you can do is have it. It is possible to do. It just takes a bit of thinking in terms of how aggressively you want the lantern to swing in a particular direction. But it's the same. It's all the same. It's all the same principle. Short sequences, randomized, and selected based on. It's this property basically, but I think this is the default action. If you don't set anything, it'll default to randomly selecting something from whatever is listed in the ensembles. So you don't have, you want to derive him on your good grief alt. I would have thought that good news, everyone, would be a more appropriate alt. So before we get sidetracked too much with Notorious, any other questions about what we've been talking about with randomization and Robot Turkey? Yes, Troublemaker. That should actually be your alt. Alt. So there's actually quite a lot that you can do. The system is pretty flexible, so long as you compensate for some of the, they're not so much issues, but so long as you compensate for some of the way that it works. So you don't necessarily want it to just be cycling through the sequences all the time. To add some realism, for instance, I think, where is the other one? Number 2. Right, yeah, so this was a bit tricky to do, this one. Did I add, let me just check. Right, so this is something that, so if you the whole idea of behind compensating for X, Y, or Z is that when you do your animation, don't just, so this, its pose is it twists to the right and tilts its head. But when you do the animation, what you ought to try and do is drop in a couple of frames where there's no change occurring. Because what you can then do is, once these are exported to IMVU, you can use annotate. You can use the fact that this block of frames is the same. So from that marker, that set of markers to that set of markers, they're all the same. What you can do with that in IMVU is, so we know that that occurs, so using the repeat, so duplicating some of the sequences, what we can do is, so we've got, where is it? Torso idle, torso left. Right, so one of these sequences is the character looking to the left, but that pause is accentuated by being looped. So we've duplicated the sequence and looped just that set of frames. And because of the way that IMVU works, it'll blend between the previous animation and the new one that's playing. So in a sense, you're essentially transitioning between two static poses, but because of the way that IMVU works, it'll blend. It'll actually create a sort of a faux animation between the two. But if you have the pause in your sequence, so that's from frame 15 to frame 20, so we've got 5 frames, it doesn't move. We can use those to our advantage, so we can have the same look to the left animation, we can duplicate it, and setting the start and end points, we can loop those various numbers of times depending on how long we want that look to the left to be. And of course, when we start randomizing, it'll select, so let's say we loop this 1, 3 and 5 times like we did with the other one, it'll select each one of those randomly, which again switches up the whole randomization and unique appearance of the character. But that does mean having to do a little bit of thinking when you are creating your sequences, so that you allow some space for that to be available to you. Frenzy that what? I have absolutely no idea, Frenzy. Yes, absolutely no idea. Rob had 4. I've no idea what that word is. Boxy? Did you mean to say box? Yes, I'm trying desperately to do that. Focus. Focus, focus, focus. I've no idea what that is. Oh, box. Rob had 4 boxes. Boxed turkey dinners. Jane had 5 potatoes. Terry gave me a cat. When did the flight land? I've absolutely no idea. Because in your world, something seems to be wrong. Quite definitely wrong. So that's the that is our robot turkey. So it's taken us, oh goodness knows how many. So this must be. I will have to look at the video stats, but this has taken us quite a long time to get through this, because even though this is a relatively simple project and there are relatively simple things going on, to explain it all takes a surprising amount of time. But Turkey was saved from being sacrificed at the altar of Thanksgiving. So maybe this year. That is no way a Common Core math question. Because if that were a question, you might as well just say sausages, and your justification for it being sausages would be because I said so. Derive, not sure. It will be uploaded. It will. The turkey will be uploaded, Notorious, but not sure when, because there's quite a lot that we can do with this in terms of the animations, and it's just trying to figure out how we want it to respond. Whether we want the item to function on its own as a furniture item so that it does things randomly, or whether it's going to respond to something the avatar does because it's a furniture item as opposed to a pet. But hopefully it will be done soon. And does the... Oh no, it doesn't do it, does it? So if this is uploaded with all the animation sequences in place and it's derived from, you can't create your own sequences, can you? Because the animations aren't visible to the deriver, are they? Yes, it could easily be either or, pet or furniture. We did think of putting a seat on this so that you could sit on it whilst it was doing whatever robot turkeys do, but we never got round to doing that. But it will be uploaded at some point soon, hopefully. They'd probably break the coffee table, Hot Rod. It is a robot after all, and presumably it'd be quite heavy. Oh, that could be so yes, if it chased you. So Notorious is saying it could chase you like a spider. That would be a complicated thing to set up, because you'd have to do an animation of the avatar running away whilst your furniture item was chasing them. That would be quite a challenging product to put together. Oh, that table. Even if I do say so myself. Half and half and half. Notorious is saying, but you are great at challenges. Terry Thomas springs to mind for some reason. That's an actor from the Carry On films, basically, or the Ealing days. Yeah, so there's a lot that you could actually do with following these basic principles. And it can be applied to anything. Well, we are coming up on an hour. Well, it's not. We're over an hour and a half, which is a bit longer than I expected, actually. But if there are no other questions, we shall call it quits there until the next session. I'm not sure when that will be. Yes, endless possibilities, Hot Rod. Quite right. So I'm not sure when the next stream will be. All the stuff to do with IMVU and what is it? The next Shannon Mac thing. Not sure when that's happening. It's yet to be organised and discussed, so I don't know. Don't know what's going on there. But there will obviously be other Twitch streams in between. So the usual thing of, if you are watching and you haven't already subscribed or followed, pardon me, if you haven't already subscribed and followed and you like what you see, click the button that's appearing somewhere or other, wherever it is, because I'm not looking at the actual profile page, I'm looking at the stream page, which doesn't have the button. Oh, especially because of YouTube's recent shenanigans. Oh, is it? Oh, okay. It's above the video, Notorious says. So click the button and do the thingy and jiggery and all of that. And you'll be notified of when we next go live. I should point out, actually, that I am doing my best not to do what a lot of other people do and make their stuff subscription only. Because of the nature of what this is, I don't think that that's particularly fair. Isn't the right word, but that's the only one that springs to mind. Because this is stuff to do with learning how to do something, I am reluctant to do subscription only feeds and subscription only this and that like other people do. I would rather this stuff go out and be usable and available to whoever wants to use it for whatever purposes in terms of learning how to do something. I would rather that be the case than lock it away behind essentially a paywall. I'm not a big fan of that kind of approach to learning. If it's for more advanced stuff, then that's fine. But when we're talking about stuff to do with beginning or learning how to do things from the perspective of somebody that's new to 3D or intermediate, or somebody that's not specifically doing it from a professional capacity, I don't think that it's necessarily appropriate to be charging or locking things away behind paywalls. But with YouTube's recent shenanigans, that does put us in a bit of a bind in terms of obviously we don't do this for the cash, but as with everything, it all helps. But even then, it still would rather this all go out and be available than it being locked away. So hopefully this stuff will still continue to be uploaded to YouTube as per what we've already been doing. But other avenues are being looked at. So just be aware of that. On that note, so what is it? Free stuff for everyone. Good news, everyone. So on that note, we're coming up on to 1 hour and 45 minutes. We shall call it quits. But if you have any questions in the meantime, the usual messages. Yes, there is. Yeah. The FBX team at IMVU used the word verbose. That's the word you're looking for, Frenzy. And it's verbose for a very specific reason. Particularly when you are new to 3D, not enough people take the time to explain why things are done the way that they are done. So that's why it's a bit verbose. But yes, so on that note, we shall call it quits until the next time. So make sure you're subscribed or following, or whatever the button says on it, so that you know when we go live. But yes, in the meantime, if you have any questions, just message either here or Twitter or Facebook or wherever the social medias is, and we shall get you sorted out. And I remembered to record this time. So cheery bye. That sounds like a story ending.